And today, very much in that spirit, we look at what I think is a wonderful new book, and one that I hope you will not only get and share, but also socialize among your various communities. As I look around the screen today, I can see that folks are from various parts of the US and certainly in several parts of Canada. Oftentimes we're joined by people from other countries as well. It's called Sisters in Mourning, Daughters Reflecting on Care, Loss, and Meaning. And it is an important read, I think, about a common human experience for which our insights are needed, and the insights of the writers of this book are welcome. I was delighted that the foreword for this book was written by a longtime water friend and supporter, the wonderful writer, Mary Gordon. Wow. I invited Mary today. She agreed to come and be with us, but alas, she discovered that she was going to be flying at this very hour to visit her beloved family in Wisconsin. So we'll hope to have a chance to chat with her on another occasion. Given the FAA problems this morning and the backup of the planes, maybe Mary could have been with us after all, but I hope in fact that she's on her way and well and truly en route to visit those lovely people in Wisconsin whom she loves so dearly. Let me turn then to the editors and then to the two authors who are with us, and I will make very brief introductions and then invite you Fore to take over, and then we'll return to conversation in about 20-25 minutes. So Soo-Yeon Park describes herself, as I quote, as a Korean-American queer feminist practical theologian. We've known each other for many years and around and about the circles of our common work in theological education, both within and beyond the academy. Supak is the newly appointed Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean at Union Theological Seminary, where she's been since the mid-1990s when she began her doctoral work there. She's played many roles there, from Associate Dean for Student Life and Director, Associate Professor of Integrative and Field-Based Education, Director of Recruitment. She was Vice President for Institutional Advancement, Dean and Associate Professor of Integrative and Field-Based Education before taking on these new responsibilities. She's also active with the Pacific Asian, North American, Asian Women in Theology and Ministry, popularly known as Pan-Autumn. And I want to congratulate you, Supak, on your new position, and just scratch my head in wonder at how you juggle so many balls in the air and do it with such grace and effectiveness. So congratulations on that, and really thank you for making this time. I can only imagine your schedule. The co-editor of this book with Supak is Rabbi Mychal Springer, the first conservative rabbi to be certified as a clinical pastoral education supervisor. She founded the Center for Pastoral Education at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. You folks are just down the block from each other, huh? In 2009. And that's where she did her own rabbinic study. So you've both been in that Upper West Side. I knew there was a reason why things are really hopping up there, but just imagining the two of you in such proximity is really delightful. Rabbi Springer supervises students in a range of settings, including healthcare and prisons, where they gain pastoral skills and provide care for persons who are on the margins of our society. And I really congratulate you on this book. I think it's really so important. And I only wish that this were the bestseller rather than I'm Glad My Mother Died, which is on the bestseller list of the New York Times, which is, anyway, trivial by comparison in my view. But two of the five people who have contributed to this book are with us today, and I want to welcome both of them. Kathleen Talvacchia is a contextual theologian with an interest in practical theology, Christian practices of marginalized communities, and queer theology, and she is in New York City, and a longtime collaborator in the field. Kathleen, really a longtime collaborator, and so well regarded, especially doing LGBTIQ stuff, and the work that you've done has just been so marvelous over such a long period of time, and it's just a real honor for us at Water to have you with us. I'd also like to welcome, no less heartily, Linda Jaramillo, retired executive minister of the United Church of Christ Justice and Witness Ministries, where she worked tirelessly for decades, and her colleague, Lois Martha Powell, is with us as well, another one who has worked tirelessly for decades in the development of church programs for social justice, given the serious issues of racism and immigration and women and queer issues and so forth. You folks have really, in the UCC, been a guiding light for the rest of us and have been so in the foreground and vanguard of this that we look to you, even now in Linda and Loie in your retirements. We look to you for wisdom and for, with deep gratitude for the extraordinary work that you've done and the ways in which you have, again, I scratch my head to figure out how you do it, but how you work with an institutional church to do that. Maybe it's because Catholic women have so little access that we can't even imagine what that would be like. But to think of you as the church bureaucrats as the ones leading the way is just so very, very inspiring for the rest of us. So thank you so very much. We at Water are honored to host this distinguished group of women. And again, I'm going to show you the book, which I think is so important, published by Cascade Books. It is Sisters in Mourning, Daughters Reflecting on Care, Loss, and Meaning. Insofar as we are our mothers' daughters, our mothers, and especially the mothers of our dear guests, are with us in spirit today. When I blurbed this book for Water's What We're Reading section on the website, when I read it for the first time, I wrote, quote, "From the foreword by Mary Gordon to the final story of a mother's death, the often fraught and usually loving relationships between mothers and daughters come into poignant focus. 7 writers from different backgrounds and life circumstances flesh out the complexities and offer queries for others to ponder." On rereading the book for today's event, I can only add to you all a huge thank you for kicking off a conversation that many of us, I think, need to have. I welcome you as colleagues, and we are deeply grateful for your work and appreciative of your time with us here at Water. Thank you, and the team now will take over.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for such generous and thoughtful and hospitable introduction for us. And we're just delighted to be here together to share our experience and what it has been for us to do this work together. It's been a journeying. It's been a lot of discernment. There's been a lot of laughter and tears and heart-wrenching conversations. So we'll just start off with an introduction of the book and how we started, and then we have Mychal talking about some of the themes that came out. Even as Mary said, each of us has approached this writing from our own context, own perspectives, own history, and coming from very diverse backgrounds. It was interesting how we midwifed each other into this writing. So I'm going to start by just reading a bit of the introduction, just because our time is short, and I think it just says what I want to say very succinctly. So I'm going to read some pieces of the introduction as a way to start us off on this journey together today. Our mother passed. That's Mychal and I. Mychal, maybe you should raise your hand so that we know. Yeah, there you are. Okay. Our mothers passed away within weeks of each other. We had both been caring for our mothers with dementia for years. Mychal's mother passed away on Monday, February 27, 2017. The day before, Sue had admitted her mother to hospice care. On Tuesday, after visiting her mother, Sue and her partner, Kathy, that's Kathleen Talvacchia here, visited Mychal, who was sitting Shiva. After leaving Mychal's apartment, Sue made the dreaded calls to her mother's siblings to let them know that their sister's life on this earth was ending. In 2 weeks after Mychal's mother died, Sue's mother passed away. "We are sisters in mourning," Mychal wrote to me. "I feel the sisterhood of our grief, and I hope to find time when we can be together before long. You are a blessing. May your mother's memory be for a blessing, and may you find comfort as you grieve." It was that email from Mychal that sent us on this journey. And in sharing that conversation with a colleague, he said, "Wow, that's a book that needs to be written." And he happens to be the husband of Laura, who couldn't be here. And I actually ask for all your prayers because he is undergoing cancer treatments right now. And that's why Laura couldn't be here, because he has some treatments he had to do today. But she was very much looking forward to being here with us. So I called on Mychal after some time passed, that we have had some time to process and metabolize the grief of having lost our mothers so closely, close in time and close in location, in a sense that you're right, Mary, we were across the street from each other. Now Mychal is across Central Park on the other end, because now she's the manager of CPE at a New York Presbyterian Hospital. But then before then, we were doing lots of projects together, and we were colleagues, we were friends, and then we became sisters in this process. So we said, okay, what do? We got to do something. Let's gather some women. So we thought about some women that we might gather. So I said, well, my partner, Kathy, I know she lost her mother a long time ago, and she's been working with this, the grief and process for a long time. And I think she'll have something to say. And then Mychal invited Bobby, who's been working on that as well. And then I reached out to Cari, and Cari invited Linda. And of course, Laura, who's my colleague's wife. So this is how we kind of formed a network of women that would have never have known each other by just, I would say in the Christian language, it's a spirit that kind of led us and brought us together. So Mychal and I were like meeting and saying, okay, so what do? We kind of felt the heart was there. Like, we want to do something, like there's something here, but we couldn't quite articulate it. So we sat down, as we do, two educators, and said, okay, let's explore these questions. So what about these questions? So the questions we thought might be helpful for us to engage together, as we thought about all the women who care for their mothers, lost their mothers, and then grieving, and all of us are in some sort of caring and teaching profession. How does that impact the way we provide care and how we teach? With regards to how we had cared for and how we are grieving. So we were sort of trying to explore that, both personally and professionally. So these were some of the questions we began with. Of course, it became a lot more than that. So the questions: what are your culture and spiritual traditions expect of you as a caregiver? Because that was loaded. All of us were women identified, and there are certain expectations of caregiving. And what were they? Both religiously and culturally. How does gender impact this expectation? What do you ask of yourself? How do these demands shape each other? What is the relationship between the expectation of your community, the caring that you actually provide, and the experience of grieving? So those were sort of our initial conversation questions. So we started with that. And of course, our first meeting was just fantastic. And some of them, I knew only 5 of the 6, no, 6. Yes, I knew 6. And some of them didn't know each other. And so we kind of gathered together and met online, because not everyone was local. In fact, we met only once together in person. We did sort of a day-long retreat where we actually, after halfway through, we decided we have to meet in person because all our work had been online. So the process of our gathering was then after we met first, we shared our mothers with each other. It's like, what are the stories we want to tell about our mothers? We shared our mothers with each other. And just to kind of give you some context, some of us had our mothers very long time. In other words, we have lost our mothers recently. There were a few, 2 to be exact, who have lost their mother when they were much, much younger. So they had a lot longer time of not having their mother than the time they had their mother. So they created a different dynamic of engagement, even as we're talking about and sharing our stories. Those of us who felt like, oh, we just lost our mother 6 months ago, we had a lot more stories to tell, and even understanding how we age, how our relationship has changed over time as we grew. But the ones that have lost their mothers earlier on, like in their teens or in their 20s, that was cut off. That process was cut off from them and created a difficult way of engaging. It was more difficult for them to engage the process in the ways that they felt like, what story can I tell? What can I remember from my teens that I could talk about here? So that as both, because Mychal and I are neither, we had our mothers a lot longer, that wasn't in our minds until someone voiced that. It's like, even in this group, there are differences and we need to really be sensitive to that difference. So we engaged. So what we started to do was, like, after the first gathering, we had these themes that were coming up. So we said, okay, and we broke it out into different themes. And then we said, okay, do you have any energy for writing about certain themes? So this was a writing group. So it was important that we not just talked about our mothers, but we went back and wrote about it. And so each of us took some themes that we felt kind of connected to, and we wrote. And then every other month we gathered, and each of us, one at a time, would share their writing. And the way it was just a space to receive, no critique, no fixing grammar. This is just a raw receiving of someone's writing and just being witness to this voice that was being spoken into this space. And then that kind of told each of us, like, oh, that reminds me of a story. Your story is helping me understand my own grief in a different way. And so we started kind of having the conversation. So we weren't really starting off, well, kind of, in my mind, maybe it was a book, but it was more of a process. And we didn't know whether it's going to be a book or not. But it became kind of clear around a year and a half into it that we should turn it into a book. And so what we did was, Mychal and I were thinking about, like, how do we translate our process in the group into a written form? Because it was so rich what we did. We did rituals each time we gathered, and we took turns doing rituals. And then we read our stories or talked about it. And it was so rich, and we reflected. How do we do that? And Mychal, of course, in her brilliance, said, well, we'll have these hyperlinks. And everyone's like scratching their heads, like, what hyperlinks are you talking about? Well, it became what we call in the books called these little text boxes, where sisters' voices inserted into the writings of one person. So one person would take ownership, and not ownership, it was like, would take leadership in writing about a particular chapter. And then each of us has something to say about how a certain phrase or thought has impacted or kind of reflected something in them, and would write about it. So it's sort of have these interruptions of voices coming in, which is exactly how when we met in person, or when we met together, mostly on Zoom, is how the process was. So and the interesting thing is, we took it from I don't know how many publishers I talked to. They all said, we can't do it. I don't know what format you're talking about. We just can't do it. We can't do it that way. Until I sat down with the Cascade publisher, and he said, we got some really creative minds. I don't know, maybe they'll figure it out. And they did. And it was just, the publisher was just fantastic. And the editor was just really wonderful in working with us. So that's how the book came. And at the end of each chapter, we have questions for reflection, so that we had hoped, as we said, that Mychal and a lot of us are educators. We want to share this and have sisters in mourning circles in wherever they want to find themselves in, and be able to take a chapter, read it, and reflect on the questions that we ask, we pose at the end of each chapter. So that's just the introduction and how the book came to be. And I'll turn it over to Mychal to talk more about some of the contents that came out.
Thank you, Sue. And thank you, Mary, for the wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and in particular with Sue and Kathy and Linda. Whenever there's any kind of reunion of our sisters, there's an extraordinary feeling of connectedness that comes. So Sue has published a number of books. So has Kathy. And I have never published a book before. And when Sue had this idea, I had a certain ambivalence about turning experience into book form. And it's been extraordinary to have it exist in the world in a way that we can talk about today and is in people's hands. And what I've learned in this is really about the project of taking something that we might consider private and allowing it to be shared. So when Kathy and Sue came to my mother's Shiva, it was such a raw moment. And they were with me in such a profound way and they didn't tell me that Sue's mother had gone into hospice the day before. But 2 weeks later, when Sue's mother died, I had Sue and Kathy with me. And this phrase that became the title of the book, being Sisters in Mourning, I felt accompanied. And I knew that Sue and I would mourn together and be part of something unfolding that is often so isolating together. And I didn't have any idea that Sue, in her creativity and in the way that her brain works, was going to say, let's bring in other women who can do this with us. So even though writing was not something that I knew about, being in a group of women was something that I knew about. And what happened in that space was so extraordinary. And what I want to say about it is that I received the gift of my mother from this group that traveled with me in these reflections. I didn't know who my mother was to me until I began to tell her story. And this collaborative way of engaging my mother gave her back to me, which was an incredible gift in mourning. So we went through this whole process. We were at the very, very end, and Sue said to me, I think we should have questions for people so that if anybody wants to read this chapter and then think about these questions that are related to the chapter, they can do this, they can have this too, which was just the next step in turning what was private into a public space and really understanding that these gifts and the pain and the whole gamut of what we received in our relationships with our mothers is something that could be uncategorizably enriched by being willing to talk about it and not being embarrassed about it. So I'll give you an example. I never would have thought that I would quote my mother's wisdom. But as we wrote our chapters, we got in touch with both the wisdoms of our mothers and the wisdoms that we experienced in being in relationship with our mothers. Sometimes very painful wisdoms, sometimes very redemptive wisdoms. So now when I teach, I often will quote my mother. So one of my mother's quotations, my mother was born in British Mandate Palestine, and Hebrew was her first language. And my mother would often say, Kol hatkalot kashot, all beginnings are hard, which is actually a rabbinic teaching. But I just thought of it as my mother's teaching because she would teach me that. And every time I would start something, somehow or other, I would receive Kol hatkalot kashot, all beginnings are hard. So whenever I start a CPE program, I sit with that wisdom. And I understand that it's not somehow little girl Mychal who just reverts to something that really I should put away by now. But it's actually theologically inclined Mychal who has access to the wisdom of my mother's as transmitted through the tradition and embodied in her. She was not a person of learning. She never graduated from high school. So it wasn't a wisdom of anybody with external degrees. But when I received the response of the other women, and coming from many, many different backgrounds, who would say, that's precious, I experienced the preciousness of my mother in a whole new way. So just to bring it full circle, one of the things that I wrote about in the chapter about my mom was sitting Shiva for my mother. And there were so many spiritual and theological experiences that I encountered in sitting Shiva for my mom. When I shared the chapter and we invited people to write their hyperlinks, the text boxes, there were a number that came back about Shiva. And so suddenly this experience that was me sitting Shiva for my mom, and then me and Sue and Kathy at Shiva for my mom, was suddenly this whole circle of women engaged from different spiritual traditions saying, oh, hearing about Shiva from you taps into something in me, whether I had ritual experiences or did not have ritual experiences. And it was a kind of multi-faith encounter that I've really never experienced anywhere else. So that was one of the dimensions of our work together, coming from different traditions, different backgrounds of all kinds, and sitting together and cherishing one another, and what it meant to be daughters, having lived intimately with our mothers. So we talked about the caring side and what happened to us in those periods of caring, some of us many years of caring for our moms, and the grieving for our moms, and the different dimensions, the different dynamics that came into play in the caring and in the grieving, the guilt, the sense of responsibility, the losses when we were young for some of us, when we were older for others of us, the way that our gender intersected with our understanding of the roles. We also spoke a lot about the way that dementia showed up in the lives of many of our mothers who lived to old age, and how we lived with dementia. And for some of us, the way that our daughters or our children were connected to us in anticipating that we someday would probably have dementia if we lived long enough. So that way of knowing that the lives that our mothers have lived pave a road for us in thinking about our own lives and what lives up ahead for me. So last night I was sitting with my daughter, and a dear friend of mine with dementia had come to dinner. And my daughter really talked about what it was like to live with this knowledge of dementia. And she has said to me before and said to me again, I will take care of you, with the anticipation that she will take care of me in my dementia. And I said to her, well, I want you to be sure that you're living your life while you're also taking care of me in whatever form that takes. And she had tears in her eyes as she said, I will. This is a project that helped me understand what it is to live with this legacy of my own mother and the mothers of the women in our group, and what gets transformed in creating community over what could be seen as most private, knowing that our deepest learning comes from this very place. So I want to turn it over now to Linda and then Kathy. We've asked them to reflect on two questions. One is, what did this process of writing Sisters in Mourning teach you about grief and grieving? And the other is, what has this book had to say to the grief that we are in now, in this pandemic that keeps morphing? We invite you to reflect on both of those questions as I turn it over to Linda and then Kathy. Thank you so much for allowing us to speak today.
Thank you. I'm just going to interject for one moment and say thank you to our first two speakers and the editors of this book, which I have been showing to people all afternoon, Sisters in Mourning, Daughters Reflecting on Care, Loss, and Meaning at the WATERtalk. And it is an opportunity for you to think about getting this book from Cascade Books and to share it with your own communities. I would just say to our Kathy and Linda, that we're almost to the end of the time that we had hoped would be for the input. So if you could make your remarks brief, and then we'll open it for questions and comments, and there will be plenty. Thanks again.
First, I have to say thank you. Thank you to Mary and Diane for not only inviting us to do this sharing, but also to Mychal and Sue for the invitation. I have to say, before I begin, I am so deeply grateful for everyone who's on the screen, but I have to say to you that I have dear friends on this screen who are from Oregon, from Portland area, from Iowa, from Cleveland, Ohio, and from all across. So some of you knew my mother well, and some of you didn't, but you certainly know her now because of me. But I also have to say that my daughter is in the house, and she's sitting in to listen to this story. She's read it, she knows it, but it's just important for me to just say that out loud. Unlike my sisters, my mother passed away when she was 91 years old, not that very long ago, 14 years ago now. And she was in relatively good health. And so from the time she fell and injured herself to the day she died, it was only 3 weeks. So for us, the grief swept over us. And it was a speedy, how do you get from there to here process. I also need to let you know that my mother was a secret keeper. She didn't talk about stuff. And she always told us, don't talk about stuff. So I come, and if you read the book, you'll see that the title to my chapter is No digas nada. Don't talk about it. And to that end, a part of the don't talk about it was she had never told us anything about what she wanted when she was passing away. And she didn't like to talk about death. She was afraid of it. She had great fear and the dread. And so it created that sense of dread for us that she was 91, had been through some recent situations of her health, but the dread of losing her was just palpable for all of us. So when it came to the place of actually making decisions, you might guess that my siblings and I didn't have the same mind. We were not of the same mind, and we talked about things differently, and each of us has grieved differently. And I would say for me, the two things that I would bring forward is the ritual. And my mother was Catholic, a very devout Catholic. So the ritual of the Catholic Church really was a very strong healing, not for her, not just for her, but for the family, even though all of us are not Catholic. But that was really, really an important piece. The other piece was really addressing some of our realities of regret, our realities of numbness, and what we felt when we lost her. And I lived in Cleveland at the time. So flying in and out and coming a couple of times during that time was incredibly difficult because I knew I was going to have to go back alone. And I thank God for my friends in Cleveland who were there when I needed them to be there. And I would say, as we come through these years of our grief time, and in those weeks after and the years after, the grief changes, but it's no less deep. It's no less heartfelt. You always remember them. And I really miss hearing my mom's voice. I really miss the opportunity to call her up and talk to her about something. And then she'd always say, no digas nada, don't say anything. So we always kept those secrets. And the reality of it was that when we started telling story and I started being part of this group, I tell you, the invitation to come to this circle of sisters was phenomenal. And when Cari called me, I couldn't figure out why. It was right on time. It was right on time. And we didn't know we were going to write a book, as was shared. But when we started talking and realizing, and I got to write, that's where the next piece came. When I started writing, and I had never written it. It was in my mind. And just those little stories. You might guess that the manuscript that we first put together was quite a bit longer than the book actually turned out. So honing it down to those very critical pieces is critically important for us to really get it to the place. And I would say now, as we think about the grief that we feel now, I would add that the same type of loneliness exists in our current grief, the same type of, we get ourselves busy so that we can get past the grief. The busyness actually is filled, I say, with filling our hours with friends and family and people we can talk to. And the other thing I would say about the grief of certainly losing my mom and thinking about her every day, I call her forth in my dreams, and she does come. And when I most desperately need it, right on time. But the other piece, I'd say that the grief that I experienced and the grief I feel we're having now is how we can turn it into courage. And the grief that I experienced made me more courageous to write, made me more courageous to tell the story, made me more courageous not to keep secrets. And I'm writing more, I'm telling more, and I'm saying more. And my friends from Portland know I'm doing storytelling now publicly. And she's in that story. But a lot of it is my story. And because I believe that I can be the author of my own story. So that's where I'd like to just stop now, because I know we're short on time, and ask you to listen to Kathy's story.
Thanks, Linda. And 3 quick things to say, because I know we're short on time. First of all, number one, thanks to Mary and Diane for both of you for your ministry at Water and for the support you do for Catholic women, feminists, all kinds of women, identified persons. And just to give you a shout out, because it's been a long ministry and really important one. So I'm delighted to be here with both of you and sharing that. Number 2, so the second point I want to make is I am one of the people in the group who lost their, as Sue mentioned, who lost their mother when I was young. My mother died in 1978. And I say in the book that I was 12 when she got sick with kidney failure, 14 when she went on dialysis, 19 when she died. She was 57 when she died, way too young. And during that time, I was very involved in her care. There was all kinds of other issues going on. There was a lot of trauma involved. So when Sue, my beloved partner, said to me, "You want to be part of this group? Can you talk about this?" I literally leaned forward and said, "Are you kidding me? Why would I want to do that?" Right? This feeling of, I don't want to feel, and I literally said this to her. I said, "I do not want to feel those feelings again." You know, and it's not like they've been put to rest, but years of therapy and spiritual direction and maturity and counsel, just, I had made my peace with it. And to do this process meant bringing this up again. And I was like, okay, I don't want to do this. But with the support of community and the sisterhood we created, I was able to not only go there, but to learn something new, which is you can go there. And new things came out for me that I did not understand before. And that was a real surprise to me because, like I said, it's not like I never dealt with this. I spent a lot of my life, I was 19 when this happened, and I spent a lot of my life dealing with this. It has defined me in many ways. Well, let me say that, it has formed me. It did not totally define my life, but it formed me in all kinds of ways. So for me, one of the big learnings was, you can go back, you can learn new things. And that's really important. And it's then third point, what I bring to what do we do today? For many of us, the kinds of loss that we've experienced during the pandemic, some of them are serious, like death, right? Some of them are the loss of a career. Maybe for others, it's the loss of the life they used to have, the loss of travel opportunities that meant they had spent a lifetime preparing for. Whatever the loss is, we have resources that we can use in community to bring to that experience. And the losses we have experienced in our life, even if we're at various stages of how we've dealt with them, can also be resources we bring to this. And this is something that I learned from trying to go back and do this again. So I thank Mychal and Sue for pushing me, and the group for pushing me, because there were moments when it was very clear they were pushing me. Can you say some more about that? And I was like, I can't go there. It's too hard. But at the same time, I found a way to communicate it. And in the book, I talk about, if you've read it, I look back at myself at that age and say, okay, what do I wish I knew then? What compassion, what pastoral care can I give to young Kathy that I did not have then? because now and I say this, I wish I knew then what I know now. Isn't that a spiritual lesson of life? So anyhow, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about this. These are the points that I have, and I turn it over to you, Mary and Diane, to get the conversation going.
Thank you so much to each and every one of you for very profound, very poignant sharing. The book is Sisters in Mourning. And I want to just, as we transition to our conversation, I just want to point out one lovely dimension of this book. And it's the pictures of the authors with their mothers. And I think this is just such a very dear section of the book. It's worth it just for the pictures, and I love the text, but really the pictures tell it all. And so such rich sharing in the book. And I would just tell your editor that from the point of view of someone who's now read it twice, those boxes work like genius. Really, that works. It works. Again, I thank you. Now we move to a conversation, and I'm going to have the unhappy duty of cutting off the conversation in about 15 minutes. So let's see what we can get in. And then for those who can stay afterwards, we will continue seamlessly in our conversation, but I will try to stop us at the top of the hour, make the announcements, and move us into the more informal sharing. The floor is open. What we do is use the participants will use the button at the bottom, the reaction button, which is allows you to raise your hand, and the front paw goes up this way on the screen. If you find that cumbersome or yours isn't working, you can always do this. Or if you went to Catholic school as a child, you can pound your chest and say, sister, sister, sister. And that was all, or stir, stir. It only got as far as stir most of the time. You were so excited because you had the answer. So those are 3 ways to get into the conversation. The floor is open, and I ask you to state something, your name, and maybe something about you that would give us a little context, and then launch right in. Go ahead, whoever's going to be first.
Well, if nobody else is going to be first, I will. I'm Nancy Monroe. I live outside of Portland, Oregon. I knew Louise and I know Linda well. Linda's a dear friend of mine. And this is the first time I've been at your water meeting, and I'm totally fascinated. So thank you so much. And I would like to get this book.
I hope you do, and quickly, because you'll enjoy it and you'll say, oh gosh, I know 3 people with whom I'd love to be in conversation about this. And I'd like to invite the team if they would like to say something about those circles, because I think those are very, very lively possibilities for people. And so some orientation on that, or even a short article that you might want to do at some point that would synthesize the book and suggest those circles would not be lost. I think the notion that you've gotten across to us about the loneliness of grief and making, as was said so well, the private public, I think argues for doing that and doing it soon, because I think lots of people need it. I think you've got a wonderful idea on your hands here, and I hope that you'll take it further. The floor is open. Who else would like to make a comment? Please go ahead. It's I know it's a rather personal topic, a very poignant topic, but feel free to share as you will. Okay, Kathy Clark Thomas, who was earlier identified as the daughter of Linda Jaramillo. How lucky of us to have you.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. You know, I'm lucky that I get to see my mom do these kinds of things. And one thing I do want to share is my grandmother was a very, very important part of my life. And she was like a second mom to me. And my cousins and I all joke that we were grandma's favorite. And we talk about stories about her. But one thing I want to share is I got to read many iterations of my mom's story. about my grandmother. So in the draft form and throughout this whole process, she was sharing with me how that went. And I know that she truly, truly loved this process and working with the other women. But one thing that I want to share is I got to know things about my grandmother that I didn't know, and about my own mom. Stories that my mom shared in her writing that I was like, what? I didn't know that. And so anyway, it was a great opportunity for me as the granddaughter and daughter of the women in this book. So anyway, I just wanted to share that it's amazing how as you go through your life, you think you know everything about your parents. You really don't. So just getting to hear news stories that I had never heard before was really powerful and wonderful.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I think what you remind us is that I hope somebody has all of those materials that are on the cutting room floor for when you had to cut the book down, because I think the archive of this project would be another enormously important thing to, I don't mean to add tasks, but as people know, here at Water, we specialize in good ideas. And one of them would be to get the archival materials through the whole process and make those materials, make sure those are safeguarded somewhere, and then to be able to put them to use. Yes, Roberta, you'd be next.
Thank you. Thank you. I had to unmute myself there. Thank you very much. I'm also a friend of Linda. This is Linda's club here, I guess, in some ways. But I just wanted to say I have read the book. It makes me want to go back and reread the book again. I lost my mother 35 years ago to breast cancer, just when I had become a mother myself. I had an 11-month-old child when she died. And just by reading the different stories and the interactions, again, it was brilliant to have the boxes where people reacted to their stories, because I think grieving is something that we have not done very well as a people. And so to have this book lifted up, that mourning is something that is healthy, mourning is something that never ends, really. There's always, I think you can, mourning is healing, but yet having a group to mourn in, I think is just really has been very powerful. So I thank you so for sharing your stories. And I hope it helps us open up to share more deeply with one another the things that bring joy, but also the things that bring pain, and how that binds us together as a people.
Thank you so much, Roberta. So glad you're here. Yes, please, Linda.
Just a quick comment about the hyperlinks and so forth. I just have to say thank you so much for iterating how important that was to us. And from a perspective of losing my mother when she was 91, I have to say that when I heard Kathy's story and Laura's story about losing their mothers at a very young age, it really brought forward the reality that my mom lost her mother when she was 17. And I had such a profound moment of deep grief for her, but how she managed that through her whole life. And that is one of those things that brought forth to me that recognition and reality among the many hours that we spent together. And I might say, we still spend them together.
Thank you. That's helpful. Rosemary Ganley.
I've been personally really enriched by these participants, and I'm very moved, but I also see a larger importance to this project, and it's the feminist. I think women's lives are largely invisible. If you look at the obituaries in a paper, it's largely men who have achieved in a worldly sense. And I think this is original and fresh and contributes to women's self-esteem. It's highly personal and emotional, but those are some of our gifts. And I think it furthers the status of women, your project. And I thank you for that. It's another feminist building block that you have laid.
Thank you, Rosemary. I'd like to add another feminist building block, which is it's the closest thing I can find to your book. It's a book called Before They Were Our Mothers, Voices of Women Born Before Rosie Started Riveting. And these are has anybody read this? I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's a wonderful book, Before They Were Our Mothers, Voices of Women Born Before Rosie Started Riveting. And it is the stories written by about 15 women of who their mothers were before they were their mothers. And that's a very interesting exercise. Who was your mother before you knew her? And I have a particular favorite in this book, which is a woman by the name of Elizabeth Gray Campbell, and her daughter wrote a chapter called Anything is Possible, and her daughter is Joyce Hunt Bouye. And the Hunt may give you the clue that she has written the story of our mother. And I will honor her simply by putting up my own mother's picture. But this is a wonderful, Betty Campbell, as she's known, a wonderful other way of getting at these stories. What was her life like before she was our mother? And it's a wonderful volume. I recommend it especially to those who have gifted us with this one. Go ahead, Patricia, and then you'll be followed by Anne.
Okay, thank you, Mary. You and I have met many years ago when I was head of Church Women United. And I want to say thanks to I was at Rosemary who said about archiving. I've just finished, and I want to inspire everyone else, documenting and sending to 5 different archives about my life. I am an extraordinary woman, but I'm an ordinary woman, and I feel strongly that everyone needs to hear the stories of women. Personally, in terms of reading the book, and I'm a friend of Linda's like others on this call, and particularly Kathy, I want to speak to you. It's really motivated me to go back and look at my own really difficult relationship with my mother. And thank you, Mary, for this book, because part of it is kind of inspired me to think about and write about what was my mother like before she became my mother, the traumas and tragedies and sadness of her life, which formed her in her later years as a really sad and depressed person. So I have a lot of baggage in business still to work through. And so I want to thank all the women on the panel and Water for hosting this.
Thank you. And we remember your distinguished leadership at Church Women United and remain in debt to you and others who worked there. I was just in touch with Sally Timmel yesterday. So,
yes.
Some of the great and good Church Women United. And you'll remember when our own Catholic Marge Tuitt was there, we called it Church Women Excited. So great to have you with us, Pat. And go ahead, Anne, and then I'm going to make the announcements and then we'll continue conversation.
Hi, I'm a good friend of Linda's too, and Roberta. They're soul sisters. And I'm wondering, following Pat there, I was wondering how many of us have had an experience right now, right here, as you all talk. You know, I think about when Kathy was talking and me losing my mother at a pretty early age. And she reminded me about all the therapy we've been through, all the whatever, and growing older and hopefully wiser. And then, but that little girl, that young person really needs that pastoral care. And to remember that again, you know, it was really helpful. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That really was a very helpful comment, I think, for all of us, and I appreciate you reiterating it. Let me close out the official part of our time together, again, leaving the floor open for conversation, which I know will continue. I would like to simply thank our speakers and in absentia, those who couldn't be with us, Cari Jackson, Laura O'Loughlin, and Barbara Breitman, who for personal reasons could not be with us today. And we miss them and appreciate their contributions to the book as well. So thank you for being together. Enjoy the rest of the day and feel free to pick up the conversation where we left off. I personally have 6 questions lined up for the folks. So I know if I could ask even one, I'd be happy, but let me open the floor for others and wish a good day to those who have to be on to other things, with great thanks again to our 4 speakers. Go ahead, whose hand is up? Cari, is your hand up? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you.
And I want to say to the speakers, please feel free, if your schedules do not permit, to excuse yourself gracefully at this moment, but if you can stay, we would dearly love to have you with us just for a little bit longer, because I feel like we're just getting started. Go ahead, Cari Roach.
Thank you. 2010, I was with Beverly Ross with VITAS for my first unit of CPE. And I just desperately need to know, are you going to be using this in your CPE programming? Because this was exactly the kind of book I needed.
Thank you. I'm happy to respond to that as a CPE educator. I have had Sue come to my CPE groups the last couple of years, which has been extraordinary. The response has been just beautiful. I haven't ever tried to organize all the sisters, but I think I should. So I love your feedback, and you're right. The kind of transparency that happens in these chapters models for people in CPE what it is to have a well-integrated story that is both personal and professional. That's actually how I start my chapter and the orientation of my chapter, that when we have a professional role that is in helping people and drawing on spirituality and theology for helping people, the need to be able to do that work ourselves in circles where we are supported in our humanity, and also to draw on that to create a seamlessness with appropriate boundaries is really key. And it's hard work to find that right semi-permeable boundary for doing this kind of work and living together. Thanks so much for the question.
And thank you for the answer, because you really touch on something that's so important here, which is that doing this work, I think, also helps in the professional work. It's a mutual relationship, that you do your work better as a CPE supervisor or as a theologian or as an administrator, because you've done this work in a group like this. And that really, you can see that the untherapized life is not worth living, and that the extent to which these things become so problematic when people don't do the work. And that's what worries me. And that's really helpful to hear. Thanks for your question, Cari. And thanks, Rabbi Springer, for your response. Who's next?
Can I just say something?
Barbara Ginhart, go ahead.
Yeah,
yes,
thank
Barbara,
you all very much. I lost my mother in June of 2016, and I didn't read your book, but I definitely want to. And I think that I'm just going to share what helped me. And like when I think about your sister circle, is talking with friends of mine. I'm a chaplain by training. In Dignity, Philadelphia, which is where I was a part of for many years, talking with other people who had lost their mothers, just feeling like this shifted. I had no idea how it shifted my life, and like that this foundation, and that talking with other people and about what this was like. And I think that's what was important. And also people acknowledging, even in the holidays recently, when I was going to church, somebody saying, that while this is a great time of year, there's a lot of people going through this grief. So people being able to talk on a regular basis, that this is everybody experiences the holiday differently. And I also think that, one of the things, and not to put a lot more work on you all, because I know you're very busy, but like, I think that you could turn this into a conference or something, because I think that I know I was a chaplain at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia at the time. I'm now living in Boston, is that they have conferences or they have like grief camps where siblings of our people who've lost have gone. And I think that as women, when I talk with other friends of mine, it's, without trying to be melodramatic, so much of the burden falls on us, in my experience, and that to be able to gather together with other people to talk about these things, the tough stuff, as well as just the funny stories, the things that, you know, over time evolve. I think it's one of the most, so I'm just putting it out there, but I think that finding ways that we can draw this together. But I actually do have a question for the speakers about, what do you feel like is your thoughts about how people can go through this loss? Like, what would you have either like to tell yourself, or what do you feel like is the wisdom about going through the process to talk to other people who are in that process of having their mother in hospice?
Thanks, Barbara. Anybody?
Your apologies, I do have to leave, so I thank you again.
Okay. I can respond to that very briefly, if that's okay, Mary.
Of course, yeah. Well,
yeah.
Linda.
One of the things that I would say, Barbara, is, you know, in my chapter, I talk about drawing on my religious tradition, which is Catholic. And that was an interesting experience for me, given my contentious, disruptive stance and activism over the years vis-a-vis the Catholic Church. But I really came to understand, looking back 40 years, there was a particular kind of way of understanding God in the world that helped me in that moment. So I think that's something, whether people practice now or they see themselves as nuns or whatever religious tradition you come from can be something that you draw upon in that moment to help you. And whatever that is, I think is something that you bring forward, whether it's something from, you know, your heritage, or something that you see in society, or something you've been exposed to, some kind of spiritual, traditional, religious connection that helps bring that grounded me in a way that I didn't understand.
Thank you. And you're saying that also reminds us that it's one of the reasons why we do the work that we do, so that people have that resource and have that access, and that the terrible experiences that most non-lobotomized Catholic women have had are not all there is. And boy, that's one of the reasons why so many, as I look around and see so many good Catholic girls in these frames, it's one of the reasons why we do what we do, because you in the moments when you need it, to be so bereft of a tradition, which many of us really and truly are, is important to recognize and find other ways. And that's why it's so important to have people like Barbara and Margaret Ellen and others who do spiritual direction and work with Catholic people who have the same human right you're describing, Kathy. So thank you.
Can I just weigh in on this also?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I think that particularly when it comes to hospice, it's incredibly important for people to talk to those of us who are familiar with hospice, perhaps because of a professional identity, but having lived it, because it can raise so many questions. And I have people who call me up and say, can you just tell me, like, what do I need to do next? What should I be prepared for? What does hospice involve? The word hospice is so loaded, and that move from curative care to supportive care can feel emotionally like transgressing. So to talk to somebody for whom it's second nature, who's walked through this, it's a kind of side service that I have in my life, because I talk so much about hospice that One experience was the wife of somebody I knew was told by she was told by the social worker at the hospital that her husband should be on hospice and they should sign him up for hospice before they left the hospital, because very often people sign up to go into hospice as part of discharge, and it's very easy to set it up that way. But her husband was not ready to be on hospice. So she wanted to know, like, am I missing my window for hospice? And the answer to that is no. You can self-refer to hospice anytime you want, as long as you're in that neighborhood of end of life, which the government defines as 6 months or less to live, maybe, as doctors might say it. But it was so helpful for her to be able to have this conversation and to feel empowered. And really, hospice is about being empowered, is about humanizing end-of-life care. So the more we talk with one another and become well versed in this and know that we are because we're talking to one another, the more we can spread that wealth of empowerment and really change the experience at end of life.
Thank you
and
so
I'm afraid
much.
with that, I have to go. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So great to have you. I wonder if others of you have, I was struck in the book by Cari's account of putting her mother in a nursing home, even though her mother had explicitly said she didn't want that. And how often do we have to do things that we've been asked not to do? Cari's mother was quite unhappy on arrival, but the next day she was quite content. And Cari came away feeling she had done her best, which surely she had. It doesn't always work out that way as it did for Cari. I just wonder if you, maybe Kathy and Sue, have any thoughts on that? If you've had some conversations about that, you know, that kind of guilt that people feel, and yet it worked out in her case, maybe it doesn't always. Has that been part of your conversation? You're shaking your head. Yeah.
Yeah. So with my mother, we did end up having to put her in nursing home, and that was not something. I mean, I think culturally, that's not what we are supposed to do. I mean, we're supposed to take care of our own parents at our own homes, and so she lived with us for a while until it was no longer safe for her to live with us. So that was a decision, and it was actually my siblings who said, you can't take care of her in your own home, even with 24-hour care, because she was failing, and we were not able to provide the kind of nursing care she needed. You know, there's only so much that a home health aide could do. So it was a very difficult decision. And I mean, there's the emotional and the spiritual decision, and then there's also financial decision, because, you know, what we touch upon this a bit, but it's the cost of care is so tremendously burdensome that I'm afraid that when I get old and when Kathy gets old, like, you know, it's like, how are we going to be cared for? It's just healthcare in this country is not meant to really care for everyone, but the few people who have the means. And so I think there is that, you know, Bobby talks a little bit about that healthcare. She was able to have someone come in and live with her mother, but she was able to do it because she had the means to do that, recognizing that is not an option for everyone, right? And so it was tremendous in terms of not just the guilt, there's a little portion that I write when Cari writes it. I think I have a text box. It was the most unbearable pain. I can't remember what and I talk about the guilt I felt when the day that we admitted her to the nursing home, and then that night she couldn't sleep. She was wandering the nursing home looking for me and demanding that the nurses call me in the middle of the night to come pick her up because there's been a mistake that she's here. And when they told me, I just thought I'd die because I felt so awful. And even now, just remembering the story, I just feel so awful about having to make that decision on an emotional level when I know, you know, when I know rationally that that was the best decision for her, because she actually became healthier. She thrived in, I mean, she didn't like not being in our house, but she thrived. She was able to eat on her own again. We were feeding her at home because she didn't have enough interaction and stimulation. And yet they had all these activities. They had people looking on her 24/7, and they had nursing care. So she actually really thrived for a couple of years. Like, she was much better than when she was living at home. So like rationally, yeah, that was the best move, but still emotionally, even now, I that's not something that I want to revisit again. It's a really awful feeling, because, you know, we also had our own rituals around, you know, caring for her. I had, you know, I'd come home and make dinner, and then, but the managing care 24/7, you know, having people come in when both Kathy and I are working full time, one of us has to just give up job and take care of full time if we were to do that. And even then, we wouldn't have the kind of stimulation and nursing care that she would have required doing at home. So, and also we were living in a suburb away from Korean speaking community. So there's a whole other layer of, like, we couldn't find home health aides who would come in. We had to find privately by talking to church people who might be available to come and do this thing, you know, help, because they needed somebody who spoke Korean, and nobody around us spoke Korean. I mean, couldn't find someone who would speak Korean. So there are multiple dimensions to care that we had to think through, whether or not she wanted to or not be in a nursing home. I'm sure she didn't. But more importantly, we felt that we shouldn't have put her in a nursing home, because culturally that was a no-no.
But so beautifully you put it in the book. Even now, I may quote you, page 44, even now, many years later, the guilt of abandoning her returns with such presence. It haunts, it lingers, it hovers, and it tethers me to my mother, lest I forget her. So that's what I mean by the kind of really well-reflected and beautiful aspects of this book, that insight that you're tethered to her, even in the guilt. How powerful, Sue. Thank you.
And let me just add to that. I think one of the ways we tried to support each other in that decision was to really think about, are we making this decision based on our guilt or on what is necessary? And that's not just a head decision. That is a deeply heartfelt decision about, what do I want for this person I love? And to get beyond your own feelings of guilt that's not in your head, that's in your heart, that helps you figure out, how can I love this person best? And we kind of came to understand that if we did not do this, we were making the decision for us, not for her. And that both of us came from cultures and come from cultures where you take care of your family and you take care of your parents. And it was very, very, very hard. But Sue was right. Once that happened, and it was excruciating, we were able to see how they could care for better than we could.
Yes, thank you. Maybe we have time for one last comment. I know we have to get on with our days here, but this has been so rich and so lovely and so really helpful. If anyone would like to make a comment, this would be the opportunity. Diane? Wait, somebody else?
I was just thinking in response to your story, Supak, and then your reflection on it as well, Kathleen, that when we care it's a whole unit that we're caring for. It's our mother. My mother died, and we had to do this very similar things as a family. It's care for her, our mother. It's care for ourselves. It's care for the family unit. And how to balance all of that out, I think, is the major challenge in front of us, that also cuts through the culture and the religion and the traditions and the upbringing. It's a very complicated process.
Yeah. Anybody else before we finish? I just want to add one last comment, and that is when I finished the book, I had a strong sense that it was all one story. And by that, I don't mean to erase any of the broad and deep differences in the experiences of the writers. To the contrary, they're vital and they're clear. But I mean to suggest that somehow the whole of this volume, the whole, and it's a whole, took on a unity that I think is rare for such a book. I could feel you all shaking your heads and affirming one another's experiences as similar to your own, even when they weren't the same experiences. It felt as not only you understood, but that there was a thread. And somehow you managed, I think, in the book to convey that, at least to one reader. And I want to thank you again for that and wish you well. I have to laugh that the boldness of us here at Water to, we didn't really assign, did we? But we suggested that you might want to really take these circles seriously. We suggested that you might want to do the archival work of what was on the cutting room floor. And we even suggested that you might have a conference or a grief camp or other ways of pulling people into this. So for people who are looking for next steps, your book has already, at least in our small group here, engendered a lot of suggestions, and we don't expect you to carry each one of them out, but certainly feel our support here at Water for those that you do, and suggest to colleagues some other projects that are available, because goodness, this was rich beyond imagining in terms of what might emerge. So I want to thank everybody, Kathy and Sue, especially to you and to your colleagues, and please let us know how we here at Water can be helpful as you continue your work. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for being here. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.